Late afternoon, sailing from Oban to Mull, the second largest island in the Inner Hebrides. Off the coast of Mull is one of the few places in the world which seem to offer a special magic, Iona. Its rocks are older than life itself. They contain no fossils because there were no living creatures when they were formed. There is a saying that it is not very thin here, meaning that there's not much separation between the past, present and future, this world and the next. It's been a place of pilgrimage for 1400 years, and for much longer than that a settled place. People have come here in all seasons across the Sound of Iona. They have sailed in ferries and fishing boats, coracles and longships. Some have landed, stayed and made their lives here. The written story of Iona is part legend, part history. In the 6th century, when a missionary Columba sailed here from Ireland with 12 followers. For their purpose, Iona, strategically placed, a link in a chain of islands in what at that time was one of the important seaways in the Western world. This is where they landed, Columba Bay. There's a stony shelf within the bay called the Bay of the Coracle. When Columba had ensured himself that his homeland was out of sight beyond the sea, he and his men crossed to the more sheltered side of the island, where they made their settlement, the site of the present abbey. Nothing survives above ground from Columba's time, but the oldest building is a chapel named after Oran, one of his followers. Nearby is the rocky mound where Columba had his monastic cell. The custom was that each person had his own living quarters, and for Columba this was his place of meditation. Two memorials to that distant past, crosses were shaped and carved and set up here more than 1,000 years ago. Facing east, the intricate patterns of Celtic art, and facing west, images from the Old and New Testament that Columba brought from Ireland. The lords of the Isles were brought here for burial, and so were many kings, among them Duncan and his murderer Macbeth. The Celtic missionaries travelled far into Europe, so eventually they gave way to the Church of Rome, and so it was that one of the Lords of the Isles founded a Benedictine monastery and nunnery here in the early 13th century. What we know for certain is that Iona was no quiet refuge. It was attacked and invaded no less than 6 times in 200 years, first by the Danes, then by the Vikings from Norway. Seals are a feature in many Hebridean legends, but Iona has its own stories, like oyster catchers, for instance, called the Servants of Bride, another of the Celtic saints. The birds were said to follow St. Bride about, but she was taken away from them to the mother of Jesus, and ever since they have been restless and fretful, always wanting to fly out. Visitors from many countries come to Iona, 250,000 of them every year. They follow in the footsteps of poets of Keats and Wordsworth and Scott and Stevenson. It was not until the early 1900s that restoration work began on the Abbey, which briefly had been a cathedral and was then more modestly known as the Abbey Church. There are 3 significant faiths in the history of Iona, and the first of these in 1899, when the 8th Duke of Argyll, a hereditary overlord, entrusted the Abbey to the Church of Scotland. It was to be restored, and when this was done, was to be open to everyone for all forms of Christian worship. Then in 1938 the Iona community was established, and one of its purposes was to continue and extend the rebuilding not only of the abbey but the medieval monastery alongside. There was skilled help from artists and craftsmen and gifts from every continent, wood for the rafters and furniture, Bibles in Chinese and Russian, candlesticks from Turkey, a painting from France. In the cloisters, a sculpture from Jacques Letips with an inscription in his own words which says, "It was made by a Jew faithful to the faith of his fathers for a good understanding of all the peoples of the earth." At the beginning of 1979, Iona was still part of the estate of the 10th Duke of Argyll, but by the end of the year it had passed through private generosity into public ownership. It was the Hugh Fraser Foundation that made this possible, and it was announced that the island would be held on behalf of the nation by the National Trust of Scotland. The gift would be a memorial to Lord Fraser of Allender. The understanding was that the interests of the islanders should not be overlooked. Iona and its heritage should be protected in harmony with the local community. In Latin, the word Columba means dove, and in Hebrew, the word Iona also means dove. And today, doves still make their home at the abbey. "Do not be deluded," said a Scottish poet. "There is nothing there but a lot of water and rocks, and peace and beauty and glories of an ancient people."